All right, since it's 5 after, I think we'll get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Student Advocacy Seminar, which is organized by the MIT Graduate Student Council's External Affairs Board. We deal with local, state, and federal policy advocacy on behalf of all MIT grad students and public engagement. I'm Jordan, I'm chair of EAB, and I'm super excited to have all of you here for our sessions on advocacy, as well as for our staffer panel later this evening. And I'm especially excited because I hope that by the end of the seminar, you all will have a better idea of the impact that your advocacy can have on policies that affect all of us by sharing your stories, your experiences with your representatives, and learning how much that can really make a difference in both your own lives, but also the lives of the students who you go to school with. Before we get into the first session, I want to remind everyone that the first 3 sessions are being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel in case you'd like to revisit them later or share them with others who are interested in advocacy. We also will have earlier sessions from our Advocacy 101 program that we run internally at MIT up on the YouTube channel if you want to check that out too. But the final staffer panel will not be recorded. We decided not to because we wanted to make sure that anyone who's interested in asking sensitive questions would have the opportunity to do so without it being publicly posted on the internet, as well as to protect the privacy of the staffers themselves. So with that, I'll turn things over to our first speaker, Jack.
Howdy, everyone. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me. Let me share my screen and we'll get started with our first presentation. So here, are y'all seeing slides? Going to assume so. So yeah, howdy everyone. We're going to start with this presentation on an overview of the federal government, particularly as it pertains to graduate students. For some of you, this will be old hat. Even so, we'll probably be getting into more detail about certain aspects than your high school government class did. And for those of you who are new to this, I hope you enjoy the presentation. Should provide a nice basis for later presentations. If you have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A system. You should see it at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I'll be responding to those at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. In terms of topics, we're going to do a brief overview of the entire US federal government. For most of this presentation will be dedicated to Congress in particular, since that's your elected officials, and it's sort of the primary direction of advocacy as a graduate student government. Then we will focus in on the budget process in a bit more detail. It's different than most legislation before we expand and look at legislation more broadly. And then we'll end with a particular pair of pieces of proposed legislation. So federal government. The US federal government is divided into 3 branches. The legislative, made up of Congress, it's the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're the ones to talk to if you want a new law or if you want money allocated for some purpose. The bulk of this presentation, as I said, will focus on them. Then you have the executive, the president and all of the departments underneath them, such as Department of Education, Department of Energy. They're the ones to talk to if you want targeted policy changes under the umbrella of some broader law. So if you want specific definitions involved with Title IX change, you would go talk to the Department of Education. And just because they're not elected does not mean that you can't approach them. Many of them will be quite accessible to graduate student governments. Finally, in the third, we have the judicial branch. It's our federal court system. If you want to file a lawsuit or if you want to send an amicus brief supporting or opposing a lawsuit, that's who you send it to. This is less common for graduate student advocacy, but not unheard of. A number of universities last summer filed an amicus brief opposing some of the ICE's proposed changes to international students during the pandemic, for instance. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we can certainly talk about that during the Q&A. So let's get into Congress, though. Before we talk about Congress as an institution, let's talk about individual members of Congress. Sort of what are they? They're your representative, but as you might imagine, there are individuals and they have their own priorities. In their career, there's really only one clear metric for success or failure, and that's being reelected, or its alternative, being kicked out of office. They have other personal motivations, of course. Some will have a desire for a real passion for a particular issue. They might have a commitment to promoting the interest of a disadvantaged group in society, a desire for personal adulation, or just an appetite for the perks of office. Some of them are looking to advance their careers, either by moving into a leadership position in Congress, or heading to an executive branch agency, or even running for president. But to have any hope of achieving these other objectives, they must first be focused on retaining their current position. That means votes, and that means constituents. Re-elections, in turn, are won by campaigns, which involve organizing large groups of people and can be quite expensive. As a result, groups of organized constituents rather than individuals, or individuals who are able to fund a campaign, will have significantly more influence than an individual person. One implication for you is that your message will be more compelling to members of Congress if you can show that there are organized groups of citizens who also agree with you. This is why it's important that you recognize that you represent your graduate institution, or even multiple graduate institutions. A brilliant policy idea, it has a chance of persuading a legislator on its own, but if you can convince your university's graduate students as a whole to endorse an idea, it'll carry much more weight politically. Another implication for this is how senators and members of Congress use their time. Most of what legislators do involves meeting with groups from the places that they represent, explaining their votes, taking credit for public works projects, and raising money, particularly raising money. Very little of their time is devoted to crafting legislation, exercising oversight, or combing through the budget. Certain legislatures do have a reputation for expertise in a particular issue, and they do devote significant time to it. For instance, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California with regards to the intelligence community, or former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan on tax policy. But staffers generally handle much of the substance of policy, as we'll return to later. Effectively advocating for policy issues almost always comes back to these components. In advocating to your representatives and senators, your primary role is that of a constituent. In that role, you can provide or take away votes, and that includes both your own votes and those of your family, friends, and community members. So then there's Congress as an institution. It's divided into two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So in the Senate, it's 100 members, 2 from each state. They each serve 6 years, so it's on a rotating cycle, so that about a third are reelected, are up for election in a given 2-year period. Some fairly high requirements: you have to be older than 30 years old, you have to be a citizen for some number of years, I think 9 years. And they have, particular powers, such as confirming presidential appointments and ratifying treaties, and holding trial following impeachment, as we saw not too long ago. The House has more people, 435. All of them are reelected every 2 years, and they're distributed based off of population. Some low requirements: you only have to be 25 years old. I think you may only need to have been a citizen for a couple of years. Traditionally, the House is where revenue bills originate, and where impeachments start. There's also an edge case, although people were wondering if it would come up in this past election, where the House chooses a president in the event of an electoral college tie. So with the actual real, functional differences of these two, in general, the House is considered to be more responsive to the will of the people due to their shorter election cycles. While the Senate, depending on your perspective, they longer election cycles, they tend to be elected by more people than the representatives. They're either the more deliberative and thoughtful chamber that exercises reason and careful consideration, or they're a bunch of old dudes who don't want anything to change. You'll see different opinions on that depending on which side of the hill you're on. So something to keep in mind in the House is that due to, in the Senate, they have the filibuster, as many people know. In general, most bills essentially require at least 60 people rather than 50 people to pass them. So further making them, not prone to change. The House just has a majority rule, and with its, a lot more people, it's much less likely that any individual is going to be holding up the process. As a result, the parties have much more power than individuals. Both have very strict and very complicated rules that we won't be getting into at this time, but you'll probably see in the news if you follow this at all. So let's talk, what does Congress actually do? they are, they're a huge part of the policy ecosystem, perhaps even the centerpiece of the policy ecosystem. And in some way or another, they're a factor in basically everything government does. That said, they do four primary things when it comes to policy. The first, most obvious, legislation and the budget, right? They also can impeach, also typically uncommon, but as we saw under this past president, more common than it used to be. They exercise oversight over the agencies. They can investigate whether they're doing their job correctly and hold hearings and request documents, that kind of thing. And they can also raise awareness, once again, through hearings, through giving speeches. They can shine a spotlight on particular policy issues and yes, whatever they care about at the time. The individual legislators in each chamber, they can trade on these powers to get other things beyond these as well. For instance, they can offer their support to a particular piece of legislation to the president in exchange for getting the president's intervention with an executive agency on some other matter. So Congress as a whole and individual legislators and individual can in fact do a lot to shape policy. That said, one of these four is the primary job of Congress, and that is, oh, and my slide's not moving anymore. Here we go. There we go. And that is raising awareness. The others happen very infrequently, as you've seen. Congress doesn't pass all that many bills, and those that do tend to be things like naming post offices. Raising awareness is their primary power. They can hold hearings, give speeches, issue letters, all with the intent of focusing attention on the topic of importance. If it picks up in the public consciousness, it stands a chance of actually getting done. It's also worth talking about typical, like the typical background of a member of Congress. So as you can see here, I apologize, this pie chart is perhaps not the most clear, but the bulk of them came from another political role, city or state government. A large chunk came from the military, and yet another large chunk came from being a lawyer or a judge. Pretty much all of the others only make up a minority. You have such things as education, some real estate, a good chunk of the healthcare profession, doctors, nurses, that kind of thing. And that's about it. There's a relatively small number of engineers. There's an even smaller number of scientists, and only about 25 have any doctoral degrees in any field. Most of the doctoral degrees, I believe, are in fields like education and public administration as well. So these are the kind of people who are going to be in the end in charge of these laws, and that you will be often pitching persuasion to. I should also mention that the staffers underneath them have a variety of backgrounds. Most commonly, they'll have an undergraduate degree in a field like political science, economic, or communications. Although there are a number of staffers with other degrees, including PhDs, in a variety of fields. And we'll come back to them again later. So each chamber, they're not a monolithic body, and they're also not just divided by party. Each chamber operates their business within committees, the House in particular. This is where legislation originates. It's where hearings are held, amendments are offered, and initial votes are taken. They are the focus of most lobbying efforts as interest groups try to get their ideas into legislation. Here's an example of that, the Environment and Public Works Committee. In order to kind of cover all the topics that Congress has to cover, just having a small number of committees isn't enough. Each of those committees is further divided into subcommittees. Environment and Public Works has four. Clean air, climate and nuclear safety, fisheries, water and wildlife, chemical safety, waste management, environmental justice and regulatory oversight, and infrastructure and transportation. You can see how even those are fairly broad. The members of each of these subcommittees are formally assigned by the leadership of each party in the House or in the chamber, but they typically volunteer for specific areas, and it's usually an area that they have a particular interest in, often because it's important to their constituents. So for instance, a member representing a district with a large fishing industry will probably want to be on the fisheries subcommittee. The committees are each led by chairs who control the work of the committee. These chairs decide what hearings will take place, who will be allowed to testify at those hearings, and what legislation will receive a vote. When the Democrats are in a majority, all of the committee chairs are Democrats. When Republicans are in the majority, all of the committee chairs are Republican. The most senior member of the minority party is called the ranking member and has some informal influence on the committee depending on their relationship with the chair. This can include getting to select one of the 3 or 4 witnesses on a particular hearing. In reality, members of the minority party have very little power, particularly in the House. One of the practical implications of this committee structure is that members have significantly less influence over issues outside of the committees on which they serve. So as an example, if I have some brilliant idea to solve international nuclear non-proliferation, no biggie, and I want to engage with my senators, I would find that Massachusetts is represented by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. If I look at both of their committee assignments, I'll see that Markey sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and therefore would be in a much better place to act on my recommendation than Senator Warren. Another implication of the committee structure is the way in which Congress influences federal agencies. For instance, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee has oversight over parts of the Department of Interior. However, other parts of that department are overseen by the Committee on Indian Affairs and the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. So when an agency interacts with more than one committee or subcommittee, that can be more avenues that you can use connections in Congress to get the attention of officials in that agency. And there's another sort of informal structure to Congress as well, which are the caucuses. You can think of them as sort of congressional clubs. They're groups centered on some shared identity or interest. One of the more prominent and well-organized caucuses is the Congressional Black Caucus. But the topics and sort of the level of organization and the duration of them vary widely. There's a Beef Caucus, an Azerbaijan Caucus, a Congressional Civility Caucus, and an I-69 caucus, as in Interstate Highway I-69. To a certain extent, these are about signaling priorities to constituents, but they can also be a genuine method of organization. Caucuses often share email lists and host events tied to their topic. So if you're interested in advocacy on a particular topic, one good place is to look up whether a caucus in that area already exists. The other thing to keep in mind are the congressional staff. They're sometimes called the unofficial lawmakers. They're a vital part of the lawmaking process, and they run all of the details of legislation. And we'll be getting into some types of them in just a few slides. There are also, within the committees, there's multiple kinds of committees. The committee that I showed a couple of slides ago, the Environment and Public Works Committee, is an example of an authorization committee. They're the ones that tell each department or agency what to do. There are 2 other types that are relevant, however. The first is the Budget Committee, which, despite its name, it just sets basically the top level number on the discretionary budget each year, just the high level numbers. It's the Appropriations Committee, which sets the actual line item budget numbers, and we'll get into in just a moment. I'm going to go into a little bit more technical detail here. Maybe this is too much, but I think this is useful when you're trying to conceptualize Congress, because these are often confusions that people getting involved might have. Okay, so as we said, within each committee, there are subcommittees. Within each subcommittee, there's members of Congress. There's also committee staff. This is staff associated with the committee, and personal staff or member staff that are associated with an individual member of Congress. Something to keep in mind is that the authorization committees and subcommittees, they differ between the House and the Senate. So for instance, in the House, there is the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. In the Senate, there's a committee called Commerce, Science, and Transportation. As you can tell, those are not direct one-to-one matches. And then also, even within a chamber, appropriation subcommittees don't map neatly onto authorization committees. So once again, in the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and there is a House Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Science, Justice, and related agencies. So just another sort of layer of complexity to keep in mind when you're looking at what committees and subcommittees does my member of Congress serve on, and who should I talk to about a particular issue. Okay, and then to talk a little bit more about the staff. As I said, the committee staff, they're charged with keeping the committee functioning well. They typically have longer tenures as individuals than the personal staff and are often more specialized. They will take meetings. You can contact them and meet with them, particularly to talk if you want to talk about what the priorities of the committee are, what's on the horizon, or technical details. As someone in aerospace engineering, for instance, I can go to the space subcommittee staff and talk about specific Earth observation satellite programs. What's the proper role of private satellite providers? What role is the FAA going to play? That kind of thing. You're somewhat limited in how much advocacy you can do with them because they work for the committee and they'll just do whatever the chair and ranking member, whichever one they work for, tell them to do. That said, you can certainly build a rapport with them. You can influence them on specific issues or items to include, or wording to change within a larger priority bill that they're already working on. So if they're already working on an NSF reauthorization, as we'll get into, you might be able to get them to add some line items that are good for graduate students. The personal offices, though, is where most advocacy happens. If you can persuade them, they'll carry their message upwards to the congressperson themselves, and they're often much better equipped to persuade them than you are. And this fact leads into the next fact, that legislation sort of flows upwards. It's the staff that are responsible for taking the members of Congress priorities and turning them into actual legislative language. These are then handed to those members who review them and formally propose them to Congress. It's then assigned to a specific subcommittee that reviews it, approves it, and passes it upwards to committee. Committee goes through the same process and passes it upwards to the full body to vote on, and that's how legislation is made. This is a big part of why meeting with staffers is so important. You're not just meeting with some hospitality specialist who's there to shake hands and smile and send you on your way. You're meeting with the people who are writing the legislation themselves. So in light of that, let's zoom in on the personal offices. So the office of each member of Congress, they have their own organization, and it can vary from one member of Congress to another. But in general, it follows this general structure. Here's an example Senate office. The House offices are typically structured pretty similarly, just with fewer people. So as I said, your time will be better off spent meeting with staff. They're more likely to understand the topic you want to discuss and how it fits into their members' agenda. If you're able to convince them that your idea is worth acting on, they'll pass it up. Okay, so if we start at the bottom here, you got the staff assistants. They manage the office logistics and the interns. Above them, you got legislative correspondents, or LCs. They mainly are the ones who respond to letters and emails from their members' constituents. Above them are the legislative assistants, who are the real policy advisors. They're headed up by the legislative director, who basically runs all of the policy side of the office. Parallel to that is the media team, who handles communications with the press, social media, and they evaluate how policy will be perceived by the media and by the public. Above them is the chief of staff, who runs the entire operation, is often a close friend and advisor of the member. Similarly, the scheduler, who determines where the member will be spending their time, is often quite close to the member. So if you end up communicating with them, be nice. As you can see, there's a relatively few number of levels of staff working under a member of Congress. This means that any staff that you interact with has the potential to be influential on the decision-making process. In general, you'll be meeting with legislative assistants in that sort of middle row. Each LA has a portfolio of policy issues, often a very broad one. They're expected to provide answers to their boss on any issue in that portfolio and to be able to advance their boss's agenda on those topics. As I said, those portfolios are broad, often too broad for them to be experts on all the topics that they cover. So instead of thinking of them as a subject matter expert, it's better to imagine somebody who can very quickly get up to speed on a variety of topics within a larger domain, something like the environment. One thing that LAs do is to cultivate a network of experts who can quickly and accurately assist them as needed. You can even serve in that role if you get to know them. So what motivates these staffers? So they have a variety of goals. Some are looking to get congressional experience so that they can move into a private job as a lobbyist. Others are passionate advocates, who are trying to impact policy from the inside. Some, may want to run for office themselves down the road. In the end, you're not going to know their specific motivations, but it's good to remember that they, by and large, are talented people who are likely to go on to more senior roles and may very well be involved with the policies that you care about for many years to come. So keep that in mind, when you go, burning bridges. Next, we'll talk about the federal budgeting and funding process because it's key to a lot of things that you might want to ask for. Most things that you want to ask for will require at least some money. So first is the distinction between mandatory and discretionary spending. So mandatory spending is the kind of funding that is tied to specific sort of equations that the Congress does not have to intervene with on a year-to-year basis. Include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing. It constitutes the majority of the budget. The remainder is discretionary, which is usually fairly close to evenly split between non-defense and defense. And this is where most of the debate goes on about what to spend on a year-to-year basis. In terms of the process, it usually starts in the White House. The White House will work iteratively with the executive agencies to develop initial proposals for their budgets that represent the priorities of that president. The White House usually finalizes this in mid-February. It's oftentimes later in the first year of an administration, even more so if the transition is delayed, as it was this time around. President Biden, they've been planning on releasing their initial numbers anytime. They said last week, and it got pushed to this week, and it hasn't happened yet. We'll see. So usually they'll issue their proposal. Then it's Congress's turn. There's a saying that the president proposes and Congress disposes. Basically, this means that oftentimes Congress will mostly ignore the White House proposal if it's different from their priorities and come up with their own numbers. We saw this in the past administration, where the president routinely came up with budget proposals that tried to completely zero out various agencies, and Congress by and large ignored those proposals. So the congressional process, it starts with the budget committees. They develop a budget resolution stating top line numbers. The appropriations committees and subcommittees then figure out the detailed line item budgets. The House and Senate both pass these detailed budgets. They usually pass ones that are different from one another. Then there has to be a conference committee made up of both representatives and senators to hammer out the differences. The two chambers have to approve them again, goes to the president to sign, ideally before the October 1st deadline. If you want to influence appropriations, there's sort of two primary avenues. The first and most obvious is at the appropriations subcommittee level, usually in March, May, into the summer. And this is where you fight for specific programs to get more funding. The less obvious space, perhaps, is at the budget committee level, and this is fighting for a different top line number on discretionary spending. It's worth keeping in mind that while you may fight for specific line items to get more funding, by and large, the discretionary line items, they're just strongly correlated with the overall spending levels. So the fact is, though, despite this being the ideal, or the theoretical process, Congress rarely accomplishes this, particularly by the October 1st deadline. They might get it done for a few specific agencies, but hardly ever for the full government. So what happens when they miss this deadline? Well, you get a government shutdown. It can happen because of controversial things, like the border wall, opposition to spending cuts, the Affordable Care Act. Several events can trigger, any of these can trigger a partial or a complete government shutdown. It basically usually happens if Congress cannot agree on a budget or an appropriations bill, or if the president doesn't sign them. Since the current budget process was developed in 1976, since then there's been a total of 22 funding gaps, 10 of which have led to federal employees being furloughed. They have also, by and large, gotten longer, as you can see here with these most recent 30. And prior to like 1980, this actually didn't occur. It is a relatively recent phenomenon. Historically, if Congress failed to pass a budget, it was assumed that funding levels would just stay constant at what they were for the previous year. And so the government would keep trucking along. But the Attorney General under President Carter issued a legal opinion basically that said that the president can't spend any money and has to shut down if there's a funding gap. And it was initially sort of spotty whether or not this was abided by, but since the 1990s, it's been pretty consistently abided by. To avoid all of this, Congress will often pass what are called continuing resolutions. They're essentially mini budgets that cover a part of the government and only for a few weeks or months, often keeping funding at similar levels to the past year. And the idea is to use these to give Congress just a little bit more time to finish hammering out a budget. Often, however, you also see serial stringing of continuing resolutions for a good chunk of the year, if not the entire year. So now let's look at sort of legislation in general. It's a little bit simpler than the budget process is. A bill can be created by anybody. Oh, what happened to my slides here? Oh, and then, there we go. So a bill can be created by anybody. It starts in the subcommittee and it gets amended, accepted, or rejected. It's moved to the full committee, which does the same process. Throughout this, the committees call hearings to investigate the bill, particularly testimony by experts, advocates, and opponents. Once it gets to the full floor, they vote upon it. Once both is passed, there's that committee, the conference committee that I mentioned earlier, that's convened to bring the two bills into alignment, and it's sent to the president. The president could veto it, in which case Congress can try to override the veto with a 2/3 vote in each chamber, which is quite uncommon. And in some cases, the president can take no action and neither veto it or sign it, particularly if Congress isn't in session. This is called a pocket veto. And after 10 days, the bill dies entirely. Due to how Congress runs their schedule nowadays, this is pretty darn uncommon. Something to keep in mind, though, is only about 4% of bills introduced get enacted, and this has generally been trending downwards in recent years. So it's only a few things make it through the whole rigmarole. So for an example, oh, what is this doing here? Okay, here we go. A couple of things to note here. So let's take a look at these, a couple of examples of particular bills that may be of interest to graduate students. This first one from 2019, from the previous Congress, the College Affordability Act. It would do a variety of things. It was introduced by a Democrat in the House, Representative Robert Scott. And as I said, it's referred to a committee, in this case, the House Committee on Education and Labor. A few weeks later, that committee, they held a couple of sessions considering it and then commissioned a report about it to basically get more details. Nothing happened for more than a year. And then right before the end of Congress, it was returned to the committee with that report. And the committee endorsed it and sent it to the full floor of the House, but the House didn't get around to voting on it before the end of the session. And then in beginning 2021, we started a new session and all the bills have to start from ground zero. Over this time span, it gained 158 co-sponsors, all of them Democrats. You can see details about what this bill did. I'll just explain one thing on here, the reauthorization of the 1965 Higher Education Act. Most agencies, most domains will have an authorization bill that defines the policies and rules for what that agency or domain does. This, the Higher Education Act, as it suggests, it's directives to the Department of Education, and it governs domains of higher education. These bills typically have stipulations in them that they're supposed to be reviewed, and a new version is supposed to be passed about every 5 years. These dates often slip. I think the last one for the Higher Education Act was like 2008. And then another thing here in the summary, you'll see it says makes funding for minority serving institutions permanent. Keep in mind that this is an authorization bill, so it's only half of that puzzle that we talked about earlier, where the authorization committees, they say, what can an agency do? And then you also have to have appropriations for that year, supply them with money. So this basically would make permanent, a bucket, and then every year appropriations would still need to put money into that bucket. So as I said, got 158 co-sponsors. That's a lot of co-sponsors. But the fact that they're all Democrat, particularly when at the time the Senate was Republican controlled, this indicates that this bill was not intended to pass. It was primarily about messaging, which most bills are, to be honest. This is also evident in the lack of any progress between October 2019 and December 2020. The fact that the committee did consider it at the end of December and vote to push it forward did suggest that, particularly since Democrats were looking to have a Senate majority in the new Congress, that they are interested in revising this bill now. Though that hasn't happened yet, I don't believe. If you're interested in where you can look up stuff like this, one good resource is congress.gov. You can look up individual legislation. You can see brief summaries of it. It's text, both sort of an HTML and PDF form, what actions have been taken on it, who the co-sponsors are, all of that kind of thing. So that's a good resource to see where a bill is at a given moment. I want to contrast this with another bill from about the same time on the Senate side called the Student Aid Improvement Act of 2019. This was also another Higher Education Act reauthorization bill. This one proposed by Senator Lamar Alexander, a Republican from Tennessee, who is chair of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the committee to which this was assigned. He was also the former president of the University of Tennessee. So you can see somebody with that background, why they would be interested in this committee, why they would propose this bill. However, it didn't have any co-sponsors even by the end of the congressional session, and the lack of further action indicates that this was not a priority for Senator Alexander. As committee chair, if he had wanted more action, wanted more co-sponsors, he could have gotten it. If both of these bills had passed, though, this is the kind of thing that could have resulted in a conference committee to hash out the differences. So yeah, that was just sort of a glimpse at some of the things that you can tell by looking at who's a co-sponsor, and what actions have been going on. How likely is it that a bill will make it to vote on? And these are also very much things that you can talk to committee staff about to learn more about which bills are the serious substance bills that people are working on getting passed at the given moment. And that can be good avenues for targeting where you want wording tweaked and items added with a chance of getting them into law. I'll go ahead and end here, with everything that we covered, and we'll open it up for questions. Also, just putting a link to the MIT Graduate Student Council's our External Affairs Board. If you signed up for this event, hopefully you've been by the website, but there's more resources there as well. So let me pause here and take a look at the questions. If we have any. If we don't have any questions.
There is one in the normal chat, not in the Q&A thing.
Okay.
I think you may have answered it partially already.
Where are we? I'm scrolling up to see this. Sorry. The chat has everything in one thread here.
It should be at the very bottom.
Very bottom. So
The most recent.
From Jasmine.
Yeah.
So what factors were conducted for your presented research?
This is during the bills.
During the bills? I guess, what factors, what do you mean were conducted? I'm not sure what I mean by that. You want to provide some clarification? Okay, then that's fine.
Congress.gov and GovTrack, I think, were.
Yeah, GovTrack is the other good one. It's not always as up to date as Congress.gov, but it's, I think, a lot more user friendly in some ways. And then if you're looking to just do basic things that find my rep is a good way to find out who find my rep is a good way to find out who is your representative in your district. In the next presentation, Divyansh will go into more details on how to actually go about effective advocacy. Yeah. If there's no other questions, I'll probably go ahead and turn it over to Divyansh so that he can get started and we can potentially have a little bit longer of a break in the middle of this. So yeah, Divyansh, you want to go ahead?
Okay. Well, thanks, Jack. That was a great presentation. Let me just share my slides.